Welcome back to the Grand Theft World podcast hosted by GrandTheftWorld.com. This is episode number 5. We have a rip-roaring agenda for you tonight, some clips to unfold. We've got some contextual history to help you understand the clips. And essentially, these are all clips by independent, freedom-loving, liberty producers who are analyzing the news, providing insights, things that are being censored from certain legacy media outlets that are out there. Helps to give you a rundown of the week, give you some insights that you might have missed. And it also links into, more importantly, we're just showing you samples. There's source material for each of these articles that we're going to dig into tonight. They're all posted on GrandTheftWorld.com, which now looks like this. We got a new template. It's rocking and rolling. It's a lot easier to find the content. It's supposed to be a chronological feed of 40 to 45 liberty and independent media producers who are out there. Some of them are struggling severely right now. They're censored from other platforms. We do our best to bring them in from whatever platform that they're hosted on, whatever far out outpost is still allowing free speech. We try to gather them all together on GrandTheftWorld.com so you don't have to go to the far ends of the internet to find it. And we're working on some more long-term plans to ensure that a site like this and the facilities and the services it's providing is going well into the future, even if they decide to up the censorship. Tonight, we have not playing first are the news clips. We're going to play those later tonight throughout. I had a clip that I wanted to show you guys some history. You guys are all caught up in current events every day. You can't really keep track and you can't know what's going on from looking at the current events. I wanted to specifically get into, I think it's called the crowding and aggression studies done by a Dr. Calhoun a couple years before I was born. So some of this footage might look a little rough and grainy. Just remember, it's good that we have these samples of media to dig into, because otherwise just reading the paperwork, you might not get the gist of it. But sometimes making content, making pieces of media about these substantial activities, what we're looking at is an experiment funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And I want it to unfold itself because there might be some sort of planning, gathering of data going on back then that is feeding into the things that are going on today. So control room, let's go ahead and roll that first clip. It's like 5 to 8 minutes, something like that. And I want you to pay attention closely, especially if you haven't seen it. If you've seen it before, go ahead and watch it again. But if this is new to you, this is the extent to which people will go to start learning about human behavior, because they're going to do it on a lower form of animal life, one without the ability to ask questions. And because they can't do those same things to us, they kind of just censor the environment, give us some propaganda. It achieves the same effect. It's a lowering of our consciousness. So also keep that in mind as you peruse our first offering this evening.
The work of Dr. John Calhoun at the National Institute of Health in Washington, D.C. has attempted to answer this question. In a unique experiment that took years to complete, Dr. Calhoun used white mice to study population growth and its effects on individual behavior. In addition to his renowned research papers, he has recorded some of these observations on film. In this 16-cell mouse habitat, utopian conditions of nutrition, comfort, and housing were provided for a potential population of over 3,000 mice. Yet, in spite of ideal conditions, the mouse population met with catastrophe. Individuals were kept track of by color markings on their fur. Factors which normally control population growth, such as predation by owls or cats, were eliminated. Transmissible disease was also reduced. In effect, the mouse universe simulated the present situation of a continually expanding population of humans. To see how Dr. Calhoun's mouse universe grew, we'll use the familiar population graph again. Within the first 100 days, the mice went through the period Dr. Calhoun called strive. This was a period of adjustment. Territories were established and nests were made. The next period lasted about 250 days. The population of the mice doubled every 60 days. This was called the exploit period. The use of resources became unequal. Although each living unit was identical in structure and opportunities, more food and water was consumed in some areas. As the population increased, most mice associated eating and drinking with the presence of others, and crowding developed in certain units. The third period, consisting of 300 days, found the population of mice leveling off. This was called the equilibrium period. Dr. Calhoun noticed that the newer generations of young were inhibited, since most space was already socially defined. At this time, some unusual behavior became noticeable. Violence became prevalent. Excess males strived for acceptance, were rejected, and withdrew. Huddling together, they would exhibit brief flurries of violence among themselves. The effects of violence became increasingly visible. Certain individuals became targets of repeated attack. These individuals would have badly chewed and scarred tails. Other young mice growing into adulthood exhibited an even different type of behavior. Dr. Calhoun called these individuals the beautiful ones. Their time was devoted solely to grooming, eating, and sleeping. They never involved themselves with others, engaged in sex, nor would they fight. All appeared as a beautiful exhibit of the species, with keen, alert eyes and a healthy, well-kept body. These mice, however, could not cope with unusual stimuli. Though they looked inquisitive, they were, in fact, very stupid. Dr. Calhoun called the last period the die phase, leading the population into extinction. Although the mouse utopia could house 3,000, the population began to decline at 2,200. In the shift from the equilibrium to the die phase, each animal became less aware of associates, despite all animals being pushed closer together. Dr. Calhoun concluded that the mice could not effectively deal with the repeated contact of so many individuals. The evidence of violence increased to the point where most individuals had had their tails bitten to some degree. Eventually, the entire mouse population perished. Dr. Calhoun's experiment is a classic example of a typical population and its growth when left unchecked. Research in this area continues under his supervision. Currently, Dr. James Hill has taken the basics of the Calhoun experiment to study social behavior even more closely. In his experiment, rats are used instead of mice. Healthy individuals are selected to start the population. The rats are anesthetized so that Dr. Hill can perform a minor operation necessary to the success of his experiments. A small electromagnetic encapsulated device is implanted into every rat. This small unit enables sensing devices to keep track of the movement and position of each individual in the population. After surgery, the rats are introduced to their new multi-leveled home, all at the same time. The rats immediately begin to explore their new environment, prior to organizing territories and nesting. Dr. Hill will trace how individuals move about in crowded situations. This movement is followed by tubular sensing devices. Every time a rat enters or passes through a tube, the unit detects and registers its presence. This constant movement is monitored by computer. Nesting activity is also studied. Dr. Hill has observed that the larger the population, the less care a mother gives to her nest and young. The same type of individuals that resulted in the mouse utopia are also emerging in the rat population. There are aggressives, asocials, and outcasts. Though these studies use animals, the findings about population growth and individual behavior are being closely compared to our own human population. Like all populations that have existed on this planet, many researchers believe that the human race has reached a crucial point in the exploit phase, a point where important decisions must be made and careful planning implemented if we are to survive. The study of plant and animal populations helps us to make decisions about the future of our human population, so that we may maintain our own balance with nature.
All right, control room. I'm looking for a fact check. Can you guys tell me who funded the John B. Calhoun study? And can we bring up that national or the Smithsonian Mag article on it real quick? Because from my perspective, these people are taking a lot of care planning our future. They're doing these experiments on the mice and the rats, and we know they don't care about the rats and the mice, right? They're willing to do horrendous things to those animals in order to find this information to use it for the empowerment and the betterment of humanity and to have a safe, peaceful world with healthy people. So I believe that they're the National Institutes of Health, that they're conducting all that research and funding it because they're looking to help people, not to control people. However, um, is that information at the end of the day, is it used for us? Is it used against us? That's the question we have to ask. Is that type of research brought into an idea like lockdowns, which didn't have a public vernacular until after those experiments? Were those experiments tied into something like Milgram's obedience studies or the Zimbardo Stanford prison experiment, these sort of things? Was that knowledge used against enemies as a type of psychological warfare? What other uses does that data that they're gathering and organizing in such a like non-confrontational way? Look, there's nothing to see here, folks. They're just, they got some studies with some mice. They're not really going to use that information against people. They're going to use it for the betterment of society. So they're studying violence, and as the crowding and aggression, that ties in with the frustration aggression complex that the Yale Institute of Human Relations came up with in like 1938. So they're learning a lot between the 1920s and the 1980s about how people work, behavioral triggers, psychological warfare, propaganda, all these sorts of elements that are brought to bear against people who just think they're getting the news. They think they're reading the newspaper to get informed. They think they're watching Walter Cronkite to find out what's really going on out there. There's also like a foreshadowing of the track trace database system. They're gathering all this information on how those mice and those rats are mating. You don't think they're gathering that type of information on people while they're in quarantine and lockdown? And, what happens to people and their behavior when you start taking away their freedom bit by bit? And what happens when those reasons for taking away their freedom diverge greatly from the evidence about reality? What happens there? And historically, is there any evidence that there's been something deleterious that might go on from these types of circumstances as they unfold over and over and over again? And there's excuses. There's excuses in the past. We didn't have the information in front of us, but we're in the 21st century. We could point to a lot of history that has repeated that we could readily learn about. The people in the gulags, the people that were suffered under the communist revolution, they didn't really have access to the world history kind of as we do right now. So whether or not it's reinforced by legacy media, it does exist. It does have gravamen and weight on what's going on today. It does provide a lot of answers to questions that people have and can't answer otherwise through the channels that they're looking at. And I think that only by looking at the contextual history of something like that and juxtaposing it to what's going on today, only through comparison and contrast can we come to make informed decisions in our lives. Control room, what do you guys got?
Yeah, it looks like Lawrence has got that Smithsonian article up there. And then, I think there's a good fee article as well out there with some decent resources to it. And
The
then
Foundation for Economic Education?
correct.
Is that fee? Yeah. All right. I want to make sure
that fee.
that fee.
And there's a Wikipedia article on it too, so we can dig through a few of those things. But
All right,
Lawrence,
let's go to LD. What do you got?
Yeah, Smithsonian Magazine article from February 26, 2015. How 1960s mouse utopias led to grim predictions for a future of humanity. John Calhoun studied behavior during overcrowding in mice and rats. And you were asking about the funding, I believe, yeah, National Institutes of Mental Health.
NIM, The Secret of NIM.
Yes.
With the mouse experiments. Okay. That's legit. They took it from the book. You can look it up.
Secret of NIM. All right.
How about Tyler? Will you look up, or if you can, will you look up the wiki page? Because I'm interested. Because I know there's a Rockefeller Foundation funding, but Smithsonian might not want to bring that to your attention. What do we got? Is that readily graspable? Because it's around the same time, Rockefeller Foundation, they're funding some other fun experiments called MK Ultra with the CIA and its various sub-projects. So when you get back to like, hey, JD Rockefeller had an empire, they went after him as a monopolist, he spread off, I'm a philanthropist now, kind of like Bill Gates, right? There's a repeating pattern. So JD Rockefeller, has this Rockefeller Foundation. It helps and is instrumental in creating the Council on Foreign Relations. And then it's super instrumental in creating the CIA and its sub projects that are going on with MK Ultra, for an example. And then all these other areas where there's overlapping. And then the recent, what is it? The technology and development document. It's under the stack of stuff here, but the technology and development document from 2010, in which there was a chapter called a scenario called Lockstep, in which lockdowns and masks and social distancing and all the things that heretofore were not in previous pandemic planning Pentagon plans, like those are new ideas brought by the Rockefeller Foundation because they care about our future and they care about our health, and they are always out there looking out for us in our best interest, just like they're looking after those mice.
That's right. And the interesting article there that Lawrence has up on behavioral sync is the term that you get redirected to if you click on Mouse Utopia for Wikipedia. So what are some of the interesting sections that you see in that article there, Lawrence?
The ethologist John B. Calhoun coined the term behavioral sink to describe the collapse in behavior which resulted from overcrowding. Over a number of years, Calhoun conducted overpopulation experiments on Norway rats in 1958 to 1962 and mice in 1968 to 1972. He coined the term behavioral sink in a February 1st, 1962 report in an article titled Population Density and Social Pathology in the Scientific American Weekly Newspaper on the rat experiment. Calhoun's work became used as an animal model of societal collapse, and his study has become a touchstone of urban sociology and psychology in general.
Is that the Infogalactica article?
That
Or
is.
Infogalactic? Yeah, I've been using that. I don't know a lot about it, but I see people using it as an alternative to Wikipedia, and I like that there's alternatives. So I've been using that to permalink to on sites and resource notes. It looks like Richard has got another book out for us. Do you have a section there that you wanted to cover regarding what we're talking about here, Rich?
I wanted to that behavioral sync is similar to the mechanism of binding factors. So I just wanted to read a paragraph from Stanley Milgram's Obedience to Authority because it does tie into overall how that study unfolds as applied to humanity. What then keeps the person obeying the experimenter? First, there is a set of binding factors that lock the subject into the situation, right? It's an artificial constraint, just like the mouse utopia itself is. They must include such factors as politeness on his part and desire to uphold his initial promise to the aid of the experimenter and the awkwardness of withdrawal. Second, the number of adjustments in the subject's thinking that occur undermine his resolve to break with the authority. So you take a pledge, like what do they teach school children every morning? What's the first thing they do before they educate you? Anyone? Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag and all these things and concepts I don't understand yet, and to the republic. I'm not even sure that we have one anymore. Indivisible. What does that mean? So there's a whole bunch of concepts that are brought to bear on the public that they're not even aware of. So the concept of giving little kids pledges early on, that's a binding factor. Quarantine. That's a binding factor. Binding factors can lock people into behavior sets, and when you're locked into behavior sets, then you can be easily manipulated. And it's not just the mouse utopia experiment. That's just like one of many experiments over time that are being done to figure out how to better manipulate and control people such that they can say words and people's actions change, and they're not always in their best interest because they don't know enough to figure out if what they're being told is true, and they're trained and indoctrinated to assume that it is. Like if we could just do one thing and remove assumptions from like tomorrow's actions across like the board, there'd be a lot different actions going on. But most people are out there on autopilot, assuming that the Wall Street Journal said this, or Associated Press said that, or CBS said this, and everything's all good, and that there are smart people out there looking out for their best interests. And if there's a cure to be found or something like that, people will find it. It's not nothing to see here. Just focus on their little hamster wheel activities. And I'm saying that's very much misleading to people. And if you keep acting out somebody else's script for you, I'm pretty sure they're not writing it in our benefit. That's kind of where I'll leave that. Let's go to the second clip. We got a gentleman named James Corbett. He's talking about your guide to the Great Reset, or Great Monetary Reset. And then we can dig into that. Let's go ahead and roll that clip, control room.
The environment.
Are you paying attention? Because all of these pieces are starting to come together right now, and I know it's hidden behind all of this blather of banking terminology about cross-border payments and blah, multilateral institutions, but no, listen to what is being said beyond the KYC, know your customer type of lingo and all of that. National identification systems are going to have to be part of constructing this know your customer ecosystem that will not only identify each and every person on this planet for the sake of the national governments, but then there will have to be cross-border regimes set up so that different systems can interact with each other virtually, instantaneously around the world. I guess there will have to be some sort of coordinating global institution that will be able to harness all of this data and make sure it all talks together nicely, and maybe something like the IMF, whatever. We'll work out those details. But yes, we'll need some sort of just global identification system rolled out. I mean, the problem is that this might be really expensive to have this kind of, like an Indian Aadhaar system of biometric IDing a billion people or something along those lines. I mean, those systems don't exactly just create themselves, and it might be difficult for developing countries to be able to electronically ID all their tax cattle. I mean, all of their population. So these developing countries will need some monetary help with this. I mean, if only there were some generous philanthropists that out of the bottom of their own good hearts were willing to put in some money on such an obviously important issue. If only there were some brave and wonderful billionaire philanthropists who understood the importance of creating these ID systems.
I don't need to tell you that the poor have been unbanked for as long as there have been banks. Why is this time different?
Well, it's really the digital revolution. The poorest have, bought cows, stored gold, put currency under their mattress, but they are getting cell phones, and the cell phone capability of identifying who's using the cell phone, letting you look at your spending patterns. That's going to be common sense. People are going to have help and lots of innovative products competing on top of this digital currency platform.
So if technology, mobile phones, for example, digital money helps to increase access to financial services at the same time as it lowers the cost of delivery, why is philanthropy needed?
Philanthropy should just be here to bootstrap this. There are a lot of regulations in this area, and understanding how those regulations can make the cost of remittances, where you're sending money back to your family in your country of origin, how right now that has about a 5% overhead on it. We think we have a role to make sure that, particularly for the smaller transactions, the regulations don't impose those very high costs. Once this gets going, then we'll step up to the applications and say, okay, how does a savings application help the mother make sure money's focused on the kids? How does it help them stay in school, set money aside for the uniform or for good future planning?
Some of what you just described, the need to move money from place to place, the cost of doing so, the overhead, as you put it, makes me think, believe it or not, of Bitcoin, because some people have said, hey, Bitcoin is the answer to those problems. Are you a believer?
Well, Bitcoin is exciting because it shows how cheap it can be. Bitcoin is better than currency in that you don't have to be physically in the same place. And of course, for large transactions, currency can get pretty inconvenient. The customers we're talking about aren't trying to be anonymous. They're willing to be known. So the Bitcoin technology is key, and you could add to it, or you could build a similar technology where there's enough attribution that people feel comfortable. This has nothing to do with terrorism or any type of money laundering.
Yes, of course. Who else did you expect? Yes, as anyone who has hopefully not just read or listened to, but actually digested the information in my Who is Bill Gates documentary will know by now. Yes, Bill Gates has his dirty mittens all over the concept of digital identification, and specifically national digital ID schemes that can be tied into biometrics that can then be coupled with vaccines and vaccine certificates and quantum dot tattoos and all of this. It all fits together, as you will know if you have watched Who is Bill Gates, and you'll know.
I mean, who could say something bad about Bill Gates? He's out there helping. He's got his philanthropy. He's just like the Rockefeller Foundation, but he's bigger, better, and he's everywhere all at once. He's in with the vaccines. He's got the decade of the Fauci. I almost said the decade of the Fauci. Bill Gates and Tony Fauci did a deal in 2010, according to the Gates Foundation website, where they would have the decade of the vaccine, and look at their crescendo. Look at that. Magically 2020, they pair up again 10 years later. It's accidental, though, because of a world crisis. I don't know. I get a little incredulous. I'm like, oh, he puts on, like, everybody believes what Bill Gates says. And it's like, how can you show people what Bill Gates is doing? Like, it's too much to even say. We don't have the ability as individuals to communicate like that. I guess we're all just left wanting until we learn how to express ourselves. I mean, who in this room could say something credible about Bill Gates and his ability to persuade people from his little empire wherever he's living these days?
I'll speak up there, Rich, if you want me to. Hey, how's it going, Rich?
Hey, it's not the same James Corbett in the video because you're wearing something different. So this is live in person, James Corbett. How are you doing, James?
I am doing very well, thank you. And yes, thank you for pointing out my severe underdressed wardrobe. Control room, pull up image search of J.R.R. Tolkien and or C.S. Lewis, because I swear to God, if you put a pipe in your mouth and walked into a room with either of them, you would blend in completely, Rich. It would be great. But on a more serious note, yeah, Bill Gates attempting to articulate everything that he is involved in is a monumental, Herculean task. It is incredible because, as I hope people know by now, yes, I did do a 2-hour documentary on Bill Gates earlier this year. Me and Brock, literally, two of us, working flat out for 1 month, did a 2-hour documentary. I still cannot believe we did that, but we did it, and still only covered a fraction of what we could have covered in a documentary like that. That could be a 10-hour documentary, and you probably.
So you're saying there's more, possibly. Yeah. If he continues to be a frontline type of guy, there might be more. That's cool.
Yes.
What gave you the cojones to think that you could take on a non-elected leader like that? Just you and Brock, and like pen and paper, metaphorically. What made you think you could do something like that? Because it is super useful. It's the thing we can all hand around. That is, it's I want to say unassailable. It's unassailably assembled insofar as, like, look at the references. What James is saying there, it's not made up, and that's something we can all hand around, and it's got great handles. So what made you think you could do it, man? Were you public schooled?
Well, look, yeah, unfortunately I was public schooled, but hey, it worked out for me. It's a good point, because I certainly don't have any formal training in any of this. Everything that I know about how to produce a documentary like that has been 100% self-taught over the years. And I suppose my...
Thank you, Control Room.
Yes, I love that. Yeah, look at that, and then look at Rich. Come on, do you see the difference? I don't. Okay, anyway. Okay, so but as I was saying, everything that I have learned over the years has been self-taught. Other than, I suppose, my English degree has given me some facility with the English tongue, and so perhaps I'm able to articulate myself. But other than that, I mean, everything has been a process of learning. And as you know, because Rich, I know you've been listening to me since basically the beginning, 13 years ago, and obviously my audio and video production has definitely improved over the years to the point where it's now passable. I don't have a setup like yours. I mean, your setup is incredible. I don't have that. I am way too busy actually doing all my research and stuff. But I should probably have a little desk like that, because it would make it more credible in the eyes of some. And I get that, I'm not knocking that. It's just, but then when it comes to something like this, where we see what's happening this year, and you see Bill Gates everywhere, behind every stone you want to turn over this year, Bill Gates is there. And I saw that developing, and I knew this had to be articulated. And I'm not the type of person to just sit there and wait or ask someone else, can you do this? No, if I see that need and I know that I can do something to put myself in it, I do it. And so that's what I did. It was a incredible amount of work, but somehow or other we pulled it off. And I am delighted to announce, I continue to get feedback. I literally just got an email yesterday from some guy here in Japan, actually, who was passing it around to some of the people in his life who are totally 100% normies on board with the agenda. They never question anything. And he said that documentary has turned several people into skeptics of Bill Gates. So it is having some effect. And we cannot take for granted how long our ability to do this online in this form and reach people on this wide a scale will last. So we're just trying to make the most of it.
I remember the first time I heard Bill Gates was involved with all this, and it was like, it wasn't even the end of January, and it was Benny Wills, and he was doing a words, and he said, oh, by the way, there was a war game of this whole thing, and Bill Gates was involved, and I was incredulous. I was like, Benny, you can't be sloppy. Let me look that up. I got to help you out here. And I was like, oh my goodness. And then I watched the whole Event 201 thing. I was like, oh, it's worse than I thought. And, he'd been warning the world for years, but he didn't help people with the PPE or getting anything started, or, they totally, it seems, I don't want to make accusations, but it seems like they were taking advantage of a pending crisis that they really could have helped to prevent. And then if you look into the deeper origins of what is the thing that's out there, there's a lot of Fauci Gates fingerprints over the whole process. So I know it sounds cliche, like he's a Bond bad guy type of thing going on, but he does have his fingers in a lot of pies, man. And you did an excellent job, you and Brock, of covering and illustrating that whole mosaic in those 4 parts.
Yeah, and I'm always careful to say I don't think that Bill Gates is the center of the web and he controls everything, but he is just a focal point and clearly a funding device for so many different things that are going on. And from there, you can start to branch out and find out what was Fauci and the National Institute for Infectious Diseases doing with their gain of function research, and what were they doing in Wuhan? And wasn't that illegal? Wasn't that technically illegal when they were actually doing that back in 2014, 15? And then you start to branch out into Charles Lieber and all these like bioelectronics and bacterial phages that they're weaponizing in order to infect you with solutions, and not just the mRNA vaccines, but the next step of piezoelectronics and quantum dot tie-2s and nanowires, self-assembling nanoassemblies that they're going to start injecting people with. You start learning about this stuff, and yeah, so Bill Gates is just a convenient focal point from which we can start to understand these other agendas that are at play right now.
So let's move away from Bill Gates for a second and just talk about the other aspect he mentioned, which was Bitcoin. And I know you've done some work demonstrating the Bank for International Settlements. They got this new central bank cryptocurrency coming out. And I always ask the question, what's the history and evolution behind this organization that has such a big influence over everything? And I remember the Telmarsh Act and Nazis, and, it's not a good auspicious, like, it's not a good humble origin for what they're doing. And there's a long continuity. And that's why I keep arguing. It's like, for those who think it's accidental, there's thousands and thousands of pages that could really help you improve your perspective. And you don't need to read all that, but you do need to read something to get outside that box.
Yes, you do. And on that note, I'm sure you have it as well. It is The Tower of Babel by Adam Libor.
I don't have that. I'm going to, though. Not yet.
Oh, okay. Well, yes, you should. It is the only single volume work like this in recent years that I know of on the BIS. Its history, its origins, where it came from, how it was constructed. It's very good. There's a lot of good info in here. It's well documented, so definitely a good research tool if you're interested in the Bank for International Settlements. Having said that, Adam Libor is obviously mainstream. So I'm sure there is a lot to the story that is not included in here, but this is at least a good starting point for people who are interested.
He's
But
like
actually, I was going to turn it around on you and ask,
ahead.
do you know any books or resources that you would recommend on BIS?
The resources, let me pull up my history blueprint here for a second and see if I do have any resources on BIS that are point outable. I don't know of any books. That's why I was really interested in what you had. Bank for International Settlements. And that is going to bring up this bad guy right here. BIS was formed in 1930. The main actors were Bank of England, Montague Norman, who's named in Tragedy and Hope, by the way. It's one of the omitted pages over the years. That was one of the pages. And his German counterpart, Helmar Horace Greeley Schacht, later Adolf Hitler's finance minister. The bank was originally intended to facilitate reparation payments imposed on Germany during the Treaty of Versailles. And that's part of the truth. Like, that was part of what the truth was back at the day when I put that in.
Hey, do you want me to give you an exclusive here for your Grand Theft World audience?
Absolutely.
Something that I haven't said yet on air. Of course, you know World War I Conspiracy that I did. That is available at corbettreport.com/WWI. And as you may remember, at the end of part 3 of the World War I Conspiracy, at the conclusion of that documentary, it did end with a "to be continued, ... Well, what does that mean? What could James possibly be working on? Well, that shelf that I just pulled this from is from the shelf of books that I'm consulting for my next work, which includes this book, which you recommended to me, Selling War. You recommended this one, right?
Yes, I did.
I think you did.
I would say, do you have this one for that? Whatever the topic area is, it's I'm sorry. Let me put it under the camera here. It's the double cross system. And this is J.C. Masterman, who ran MI6. Let me do it like this. I was not prepared. Look at me doing it live, guys.
Yep.
Doing it live. There we go. In here is where they talk about, so this is the guy who ran MI6 during World War II. And in that book, he talks very clearly that they knew that Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked. It was their spies gathering the information on it. So if you're looking at the British propaganda campaigns, you have the Irregulars book, right?
I don't. Nope.
All right, so I can make you a short list because I read 40 books on what seems to be that topic, and I have them all here, but I don't have them all.
I was going to say, I don't have the double cross system, but that was obviously a part of Double Standards, the Rudolph Hulse cover-up.
Yeah.
By Lynn Picknick, Clive Prince, and Stephen Pryor, who also wrote...
I love it when he goes to the books.
Another one, which you have recommended in the past, Friendly Fire.
Yeah.
Very good book. Lots of key details in here. And some other books along these lines that you might recognize. Oof, they're falling all over now. Obviously, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, Anthony Sudden. Conjuring Hitler.
Yes.
Preparata. That's it. That's his name. Lying About Hitler. Richard J. Evans. The Anglo-American Establishment, obviously.
Right on.
So you might get a sense of what I'm working on from that, but I won't name it yet, but you'll get it. See, that was my plan for 2020 until 2020 intervened and kind of derailed that plan. So hopefully I'll have some chance to work on it in 2021.
I got Guido Preparata here as one of the books that I, because he did the afterword for the Sean Stone book that I did the foreword for.
Right.
He's an astute observer. So I don't have that book. It's been in my cart for some time. I don't think I have the Conjuring Hitler
definitely
book.
You need that one. That's absolutely essential.
Well, I'm going to make a short list of the other books that I think tie into that topic. That way you have broad selection and you can pick the best.
I will greatly appreciate that. And in fact, that's why I was interested in talking to you today about the subject of books. because I thought to myself, I know a lot of people, but who do I know that has a genuinely impressive collection of physical books? And I racked my brain, and you were absolutely the top of that list. You are always pulling out not only books referencing, what you're talking about, but specifically like old books out of print, rarities, all sorts of stuff that most people don't have access to. I want to pick your brain a little bit about book reading and the value of physical books. Here's an example. I was watching a recent Grand Theft World where you mentioned one of my reports. I think it was when I was talking to Pete Quinones. At any rate, you cut to your room there and you pulled out Superclass by David Rothkopf, which I had mentioned, and you went through some of the passages of it, which is great. Awesome. That's a book more people should probably know about, and I'm glad you did that. But it just, it occurred to me, wow, this guy has the reference for everything, and he's got it all in his library. So let's get some details there. Let's talk about your library a little bit. How many books would you estimate that you have?
I have a lot less. I have a lot fewer books than when I moved into this house. And now that we have to move again soon, I'm going to be, trying to whittle it down. But I have mainly books because before I started learning for myself, I didn't have a whole lot of books. I didn't need a lot of books. I thought I had been programmed to know everything. I had a college degree. I'm being successful. I read Wall Street Journal, New York Times. I'm good. I watch whatever and I learn. But then I started to encounter things that weren't on my terrain, weren't on my map, but they were definitely part of the terrain. And I started looking into, trying to use the internet. And I couldn't make heads or tails of it because I'm like, what's the sources? Nobody was doing a good job of presenting where the source material comes from. And so I was having trouble integrating that which exists, that there is information about it on the internet, but I didn't really trust it. So I said, if I start getting older books pre-internet, and if I get the first editions of these books, it's not even like they changed it in a reprint, then I could start to gain some traction. And there are, in this room, there's, this is the middle size room. So there's another bigger room that has books. There's this room, and then there's the books in my office, which is a much more condensed and potent collection. But the ones in here are basically proof of the Anglo-American establishment over the past 120 years, the history of their behavioral psychology development and mind control experiments, and CIA and MI6 and foreign policy and United States Senate, foreign relations of the United States during critical times in American history. The Colonel House papers up here by Charles Seymour that we used in the World War I series because we were talking about, did these guys know maybe that stuff was going to happen? Did they make the most out of that crisis maybe by scheduling it? And sure enough, you got to read their papers. I also have Lord Grey's papers up there right next to Colonel House because they were the ones hanging out. And if you just cross check, it's like, here it is. And then a whole bunch of books here on the corruption of the education system. And it's not just like John Taylor Gatto. Those books go all the way back into the 1920s. Specifically in the 20s, people thought that maybe the British had tricked us into World War I. They were raising questions about Rhodes Scholars in America, these sort of things. And this comes from a book on the Pilgrim Society. I was really surprised that this was in here. I'm like, they're admitting to people were catching on to their angle of trying to get America back into the British Empire. So let me see if I have that page handy. There was a couple of them in here. Oh, this part's awesome. This is worth waiting for a second. Let me get this focused up. Can we get it in focus? Yeah, there we go. This is a footnote, by the way. This is a footnote on page 75 of the book Pilgrim Society and Public Diplomacy, which was recommended to me by my good friend Kevin Cole. He said this is a must read. Footnote number 58. In December 1895, shortly after Grover Cleveland's message to the United States Congress regarding the Venezuelan border crisis, Conan Doyle had written a letter to the London Times in which he said he wanted to see, quote, an Anglo-American society started in London with branches all over the empire for the purpose of promoting good feeling, smoothing over friction, laying literature before the public, which will show them how strong the arguments are in favor of an Anglo-American alliance. And there's a whole bunch of footnotes around that. In addition to joining the Pilgrim Society, Conan Doyle was a member of both the Anglo-American League and the Atlantic Union. And then it goes through a bunch of references for that. That's also listed in the Grey Papers, right? Lord Grey that we were just talking about. His desire for Anglo-American friendship was also sometimes manifest in his fiction writing. For example, in the Sherlock Holmes story, The Adventure of the Noble Bachelor, when Holmes admits that he, quote, was one of those who believe the folly of a monarch and the blundering of a minister in foregone years will not prevent our children from someday being citizens in the same worldwide country under a flag which shall be a quartering of the Union Jack with the stars and stripes. Published in 1892, the story involves a marriage between an American woman and a British lord, kind of like Prince Harry's wedding that happened recently. So they're looking to, how do we ameliorate the British Empire with the American colonists who became free? Holmes' quote is demonstrative of his desires for some sort of Anglo-Saxon union that were held by people like William T. Stead and Cecil Rhodes. And then there's references for where that comes from. So I just thought, given your knowledge of William T. Stead and Cecil Rhodes, James, that you would find that passage in particular interesting. Now, the part I wanted to get to was where he's talking about, or where they're talking about in this book about there was sentiment of an anti-Anglo establishment. Let me see if I can find that. Oh, it's right here. Let me cut back to this for you guys. Importantly, however, both groups, these Wilsonian Democrats and these irreconcilable Republicans, as they called them. Importantly, however, both groups deployed anti-British arguments in criticism of the treaty and questioned whether the United States should so closely ally itself with the imperialistic British. Some congressional critics, like Tennessee's John K. Shields, even perceived an attempt by pro-British Americans, including those who had participated in the Rhodes scholarships, to forge a British-American union. This would not be the last time in the 1920s that expression was given to fears about Anglo-American elites attempting to subvert the United States' independence. So that's one of the examples. But I was interested in, as early as the 1920s, there are people figuring out, wait, why are we getting so close with our former enemy, Britain? And from that aspect going forward, it's like if you break into a chronological study of how this unfolded over time, it does. It starts at the American Revolution, and you have to understand who the British Empire is, who the East India Company was, what their trade was, why they dumped the tea, and then you got to move forward with all the other things you need. And so I just kept finding questions and finding books and what's the earliest copy, or somebody would mention it in a footnote, and I'd have 10 books I have to get. And that went on from like 2003 until like 2010 before I started really outputting. It was 2009 as the Peace Revolutions when I started outputting it. So it was I read out of necessity, not because I had a lust for reading. I just had a lust for knowledge and a passion for knowing what the truth is, because obviously it is available, but no one's kind of read it and amalgamated it and organized it and presented it in the way that I was coming to understand it. And that's where I saw, like, I don't want to be in front of a camera or a microphone. I'm a real introspective, introverted type of person. It's a real challenge for me to do on a daily basis. And I exercise that, I trigger that complexity because I know I become a better person when I'm able to step up and be those things that I want to be. So, I was building up so much knowledge about it and wanting to communicate it before I forgot it that led me to the necessity of media production.
You know, that is an interesting point, because I have noticed your recall on a lot of things is really impressive, specific names and dates and details. And I assume at least part of that is your dedication to the literacy of knowing these books and reading them and making notes. I mean, walk us through your system for how you internalize and digest this data.
All right. So the first thing I did when I got this Klaus Schwab book, first thing I did was I went to the index and I was like, what's covered in this book? So the first thing I do is not read table of contents. I don't read chapter 1. I don't read all that stuff at the beginning. I go to the index because anything substantial is usually talked about in the index. And you know what happened, James? There's no index in this book, which tells me they don't want me to word search in this book. And they definitely have the ability to bring me an index. So then I went to what is the last appendix in the book? And it's all about the internalization of technology. So let me just show you. I'll show you real quick. I read it last week, but just for your benefit, it's like implantable technologies. This is like, so my first, it's like the good parts, the bad parts.
Just a side note. I just read that appendix deep shift. I slightly read that wrong when I read that on.
Yeah, we are in some deep shift with this. So, so My process for reading a book. That's an excellent question. So first, I have a need for almost every book I've ever ordered, and I started out at like Barnes and Noble, and I'm like, what do they have to offer that's off the beaten path? And there's like nothing. So then I started going to American Book Exchange, which is a great place to get used books. And then Amazon came along later, and it's easier sometimes, but not necessarily. If you want to find the good books, you go to American Book Exchange because they're a serious business. It's been in business for a long time. So I would start getting tons and tons. I don't need used. I mark my books up. If I buy first edition copy, whatever, I need to make it useful. So I'm going to go through that book and harvest the nuggets out of it. Whether it's Kernel House or any of these other books that are probably really, really valuable, I've marked them up now and makes them more valuable, in my opinion, because now they're useful. I can find that data. I know where it's at. I know what's in the book. I know I marked it. I remember what part of the page it's on. And then as I go through, I use a highlighter. I got a highlighter and it's got little tabs on it. These are really hard to get, so I'm going to tease you with this, but as you see, there's one tab left in this one. That's really convenient, and I can tear through huge Neil Ferguson books on the Rothschilds or Empire, so I have a method. And then going through a book, I've marked it up. I know what's in there, and then I would start to assemble ideas on index cards like these. And then you get stacks of index cards. You play solitaire with yourself. You're like, this goes here, this goes here. And then you go through each stack and you organize them. And then you're able to make media, and you make that information. All that work is useful. So I overlearn as a natural thing. And I learned how to leverage my overlearning to pay it forward to others, because I don't think everyone has the time, willingness, or necessarily the aptitude to go through all this literature to come out and communicate with people. And being that I lost a multi-million-dollar career, I sacrificed it through doing actions that I take responsibility for and blowing the whistle. But like that, I wanted that career at the time. And through that process of representing myself, I discovered the law firm I'm up against was created by JP Morgan to do hostile takeovers. And they defended the United States government, Iran, Contra, and BCCI. What is going on here? And then I started to learn a little bit more about the world through that process. It's been very enriching.
Excellent. Yeah. Overlearning, that's a good concept, because I'll tell you a little bit about my own process, which I don't recommend. It works for me, but I don't recommend it because it is not an efficient process. But when I'm going through these books, I got the highlighter, and I'm obviously making notes of all the things that I think are interesting that I could use. Oh, that's an interesting tidbit there. And then I'll move on to the next book, move on to the next book. And then when it comes to time to work on assembling this into the documentary, I'm going to go back through all the books, pick out all the highlights, physically type them out from the book into my notes on my computer as a way of internalizing, so that I know these quotes and I know what they're saying. I know them inside out. Then sorting them out into subject matters, dates, places, people, events, whatever. And then I can start to structure that into, okay, so what's my narrative here? How am I going to tell this story, and what comes first and what comes next? And then I can say, okay, I got a quote for this. I got a quote for this. I got this piece over here. And that's how it's going to, but I mean, that's work on top of work, on top of work, on top of work. If I had an efficient system, I'm sure I could do that in one or two steps, but actually the doing it and doing it again and looking over it again actually helps me to internalize the material as I'm working on it. So
I think
it's not
part
efficient, but it works.
But it definitely works. And I think the part where you type it out, that's the part where you're really internalizing it. And now it's good to have some insights on how those scripts come together. And then Brock adds because I've always thought, like, how does he do this? Or, when they watch all this footage, like how much footage did you have to watch of Bill Gates over the years to find those pieces? And how are you categorizing it? And I know how, like, Kevin Cole and I did it for State of Mind, the Psychology of Control. Like, we watched 40 hours of interviews. We transcribed everything in every interview. Yep. And then we had hotspots. And from those hotspots, we're like, we can puzzle piece it together. So do you find it like a scintillating experience, like puzzle piece playing? Is it work, or is it your brain doing something natural?
Right. No, that might be a good way of putting it. Yeah, like, for example, when I recorded with you for the World War I conspiracy, we recorded a long conversation. And then I would, first of all, I got the transcript of that. I think someone actually transcribed that one for me, but usually I just will upload it to YouTube so that it auto transcribes. Hey, make use of their technology for my own purposes, so that I can get the transcript. So I have it there. I can read it, but then I'll put it on audio, and I'll have it in the car when I'm driving, whatever. I'll be listening to it, and I'll listen to it a couple of times just to pick out, okay, I definitely need that bit. Okay, that's a good bit. And then I can go through the transcript and sort that out and clip those bits out so that I know I'm going to need those later on. And then they work their way into the narrative that way. So again, it's over and over. I mean, obviously I'm looking at this over and over. With Bill Gates, yeah, don't even get me started. I watched dozens and dozens of hours of lectures and interviews, and that horrible voice is just ingrained in my ear at this point. But
Now share the magic with people. No matter what you think you know something, and that's why you want to make a film or a project or whatever, write a book, but you don't know anything until you start doing that project. And so it's almost like a trick. It's like you think you know enough, and then you get into it. You're like, well, I really need to learn some more in order to do this thing and move it forward. How do you consistently crank out that process? Because I think that's one of the most impressive parts. It's not just the gravamen of facts that you're bringing together and the weightiness of what it means. It's like the fact that you do it every couple days, it seems, man. So how's that work for you?
I wish I had something to impart to you. I wish I could say, oh, this is how, but honestly, it's just who I am. I would be doing this. I often say I would be doing this research whether I was doing the podcast or not. But in a sense, maybe I wouldn't, because there are many times where I'm aware, okay, I got to put something out. I've got a podcast to do. I'm interested in this. Let's do this. And I decide on something, and then I start getting into the research, and then I put it together. And it's funny to me that sometimes what feel to me the most slapdash kind of podcasts where I wasn't prepared for it, and I just had to dive into it and immerse myself in it for a week, and then pop up and put out as podcasts. Those type of podcasts, I'm like, I hope I got it all in there. I hope it makes sense. Does that work? And then inevitably, those are the ones that I get the best feedback about. Like, that was great. I'm like, okay, good. That was a success. Yay. But actually, yes, part of knowing a subject is being able to articulate it, being able to put it into a narrative and connect the dots and put it in a way that you can teach it to other people. That is one way to show that to yourself, even, that you know a subject, and you learn things by having to put it into that form. So yes, I think I'd be looking at these things if I didn't have a podcast, but I wouldn't, certainly not in the depth that I do. It is because I have this podcast and I have a responsibility to hundreds of thousands of people who are watching my work. I take that very seriously. I do my level best to try to really synthesize as much material as I can and put it out as best as I can. And it's that motivation actually helps me to do this research, which I would probably be doing on a more surface level if it wasn't for that process. So that is valuable to me. But getting back to books, I want to specifically address digital versus physical, because you have an impressive physical library. My library physically is not so impressive. I have a big digital library, but I mean, there are dangers to working with digital libraries. Give us your thoughts on digital versus physical.
I like digital when it's a book I'm not familiar with and I need to word search it to see what topics are in there, these sort of things. But otherwise, I really don't read a whole lot of books online. I don't have a Kindle. If you give me something to read that it's serious, I'll probably print it out, because then I can mark it up and I can instantly, like, I'm a very tactile. There's something about tactile learning. And I think that goes away when everything's ubiquitous on the same screen all the time. It's not as registering in your mind. I also think that as I learn and I, for instance, put something in my history blueprint, the action of putting those thoughts in there and making those connections, adding the attachments, it's building neurons in my brain. So I would credit a lot of my memory about the content that I'm interacting with, not just taking my reading seriously, or if you have the audio version, read and listen at the same time. That's a huge step forward, but I don't do that very often. I don't listen to things fast, so I don't push 2x to listen. I just listen at normal speed. And if it's not worth listening at normal speed, then I might not do it. Electronic books, they are really great to be able to pass to other people. So if there's a bunch of source material, like for instance, I don't have the real book of the Reese Committee hearings. I have a PDF that can be printed out that Charlotte Iserby rescued and saved and these sort of things. There are some documents like that, but anything substantial, like, the last will and testament of Cecil Rhodes, you can get that on archive.org. I don't know, it's a PDF. But when you have the actual book, and the version of the book I have was William T. Stead's personal copy, and it's stamped on the inside, review of reviews. This was the guy who wrote the last will and testament of Cecil Rhodes. So I'm like, this is the surest thing that's on the market out there. And I have the story of the guy who bought that whole library from review of reviews once upon a time. It's interesting. But yeah, having the artifact, or even some of these earlier pre-Carol Quigley books I have over here, Porter Sargent, on education and war, and the fact that our schools were being changed to get into a war mentality, and that according to this Pilgrim Society book right here, they were changing the attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs of people in the 1920s to be more pro-British through changing American history books. So this ties back into maybe that selling war topic that you opened up with, James, where there's a group who has a superior set of experience to a nascent America who didn't in the 20th century have their own intelligence network. The East India Company's intelligence network, I'm sorry, the British Empire's intelligence network, MI6, like it goes back in history, and there's a lot of evidence of how it evolved over time and why it evolved over time too. And America got sucked into that, and before we knew it, we were playing in the great game, which is another whole great idea. There's a ton of books on that concept and the new great game that they're seeking to play with us right now in this great reset. And I just really feel like it's in getting into the books. Plus, books are cool. They're like the albums. Like, you know, people obsess over their LP vinyl with the album covers and everything. It's like, if you don't have a copy of the book and, you know, the cover art, this was done by our graphic artist, Greg Hardesty, by the way, because I thought Sean's cover was lacking. I was like, hey, man, we can make you a cool cover. And I conceptualized this, and I said to Greg, can we have an American flag with the Union Jack? Because that's what the Pilgrim Society, that's what Conan Doyle said. Can we have a flag that has both things on it and unite and take over the world? That's these people's goal. They haven't been confronted. People haven't understood the legacy of information because people like us are still in the process of articulating it. But now I think there's a lot of good reason for people to wake up and smell the coffee. There's something going on. There's a long history behind it. It didn't just happen with this pandemic plague situation. And there's going to be a lot more changes really, really quickly because they basically moved their plan 10 years ahead of time. And fortunately for us, I think technologically we might have been 15 years ahead. So we might still have a buffer even after they do this great reset and the shakeup and the Bitcoin and all this other stuff. But I remain the eternal optimist because I learn so much every day that I know I couldn't have been that smart yesterday. And so because there's this unknown and I don't take it as a threat, I take it as an opportunity to learn and outgrow our fears. I can continue to engage in all this work with a smile and a plan and the resourcefulness to get her done.
Well, let me speak just for a moment on behalf of digital books. Because I do find them useful. And for example, we're talking World War I conspiracy. And of course, you mentioned the intimate papers of Colonel House, which I think you cited from in your interview and that I used in the documentary where he's talking where essentially they're talking about the Lusitania ahead of time.
He and Lord Grey and Lord Grey had just met with the king. Yeah, I think I could find it if you want.
Well, that would be impressive. Why not?
Let's see.
I bring it up because I, of course, do not have the physical copy of it. But I was able to find it on archive.org and able to link actually to the scan of that particular page in the hyperlink for the World War I conspiracy, where I can show people where that quote comes from, which is important to me. I know it's not important to a lot of the audience, but the real researchers in the crowd, I think, will appreciate that. And the ability to instantaneously link to a particular page in this extremely old book that most people don't have a physical copy of is extremely, extremely valuable for humanity.
Oh, let's see. Do you have a date? Let me see, because I'm in 1911.
It's page 435 of this archive.org edition. London, May 5th, 1915.
1914.
Colonel House to the President, telegram.
1914. Oh, it could be on the screen one right here. Something's at the end of the book. Freedom of the Seas. We might be getting close to it.
435?
435 right here.
There it is. Yeah.
Which part is it?
On the morning of May 7th, House and Gray drove out to Kew.
Let's see. Is it May 11th?
Oh, maybe it isn't 435 of your edition. No, that looks different.
But if you tell me
it's a slightly different edition.
It talks about Lord Kitchener. This is Colonel House.
Oh, it's right there. Right there.
Yeah, right here.
Colonel House to the President on the other page, 432. On the morning of May 7th.
Oh, right here.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let's get it squared up. On the morning of May 7th, House and Lord Grey drove out to Kew. Oh, that's interesting, right? Kew. they're talking about Kew Gardens, but that's like Q from James Bond.
Yeah.
We spoke of the probability of an ocean liner being sunk, recorded House, and I told him if this were done, a flame of indignation would sweep across America, which would in itself probably carry us into the war. An hour later, House was with King George in Buckingham Palace. We fell to talking, and strangely enough, the colonel wrote that night of the predictability of the German sinking of a transatlantic liner. He said, suppose they should sink the Lusitania with American passengers on board. That evening, House dined at the American Embassy. Dispatch came in stating that at 2 p.m, a German submarine had torpedoed and sunk the Lusitania off the southern coast of Ireland. Many lives had been lost. Now, what's the providence of this book? For these characters. Let's see. Intimate papers of Colonel House behind the political curtain. And let me get to the page of copyright because that's what people need to see at home. This is where you get the future right there. And 1926 is the first edition. Did it get in focus? I'm going to have to work on that, bring it down. 1926, first edition. Who is it to? Who's this guy? Someone should look up who this guy is. Anyway, that's the artifact, James, that was used and inspired throughout World War I conspiracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I say, it's incredible that not only, obviously it's great that you have the physical copy of it, but it's incredible that we have the scan of the book that we can digitally hyperlink to. And so we can reproduce that information at will. All over the planet. That's incredible. And also, and also, this is why I brought up Superclass earlier, because you had the physical copy. I don't have a physical copy of it. It is on archive.org, but it's available for borrowing, as a lot of books are. But it's a useful feature. It used to be more useful, but you might have noticed if you use archive.org that now you can only borrow for 1 hour. You used to be able to borrow for 2 weeks, I think, but now it's 1 hour because they're getting massively sued right now. Because how dare you lend out books via your internet library? That you can't do that. Naughty.
They're under attack. They're under attack right now. There was an Aaron and Melissa Dykes Truth Stream Media on the Haiti Trust, where even the physical books are now, being
exactly right. I was going to ask you about that if you'd seen that, because yes, they did a great report on that, and yes, this Haiti Trust came out of nowhere and has these agreements with these libraries that. If you want to sign up with us, yes, you can distribute these digital copies to anyone who wants, one at a time, of course. But if you do so, you cannot physically put that book on your shelf. If it's in our repository, you can't physically loan it out. What are you signing up to? So now we're going to trust literally this Haiti Trust that came out of nowhere that suddenly has the depository of all books. What could possibly go wrong? How could they ever possibly manipulate that data?
And then they've got this recent thing, a World Economic Forum exercise called Cyber Polygon. It's about, what happens if you got cut off from the internet for a long period of time. Do you have the information around you that you need to survive? Even if it's still electronic PDF, you can read it. That's cool. But if you can't connect to the internet, a lot of people are fully dependent. They have taken away the libraries left to us by that great philanthropist, Andrew Carnegie, right? So it's like that was there to build the society that they needed for control. And now that they have that, they don't need the people to have widespread knowledge, and they certainly don't need you to have an uncensored internet. So these types of things, times, as Bob Dylan said, they are a-changing.
Oh, yeah. Speaking of which, yeah, if we really did lose all power, I have a feeling this would probably become my most valuable, actually, piece of literature, How to Grow More Vegetables. I think this type of information might be more important than the learning of dates and figures from ancient history, at least during that kind of event. And also, this one will be particularly valuable. It's The Beatles Tune In by Mark Lewis, and the 1,000-page document of the up until 1963, not including 1963. This is just volume 1, which is itself 2 volumes of a 3-volume projected 3-volume set, which will probably
I hope it has pictures.
Huh?
I hope it has pictures in it.
nope, it's all text. So if you happen to be a Beatles, not just fanatic, but ridiculous hyper fanatic, this is definitely the book for you. And
Or if
I
you need
can't
one-
wait until 2030 when he actually finishes writing it.
Yeah, if you need one book to be a doorstop and a quarantine friend, that could be it. I think I'd go for Plutarch's Parallel Lives first before I got into that many pages on one band. They did make great music. I love the Beatles before they broke up, and the things they did after. I have respect.
I'm thinking
But
if all the
that's a lot of
power goes
pages,
off
man.
and we don't have access to electronics, I won't be able to listen to them. So I'll just have to read about them.
Hey, on your gardening tip, I've got a student here in season 4. He has a nonprofit, and he's teaching people how to do aquaponics and full cycle gardening. So it's not just growing your own vegetables, but it's learning how to do that in a sustainable way where it's hands off. And so, yeah, that's a good first start. Plus, Luke Radowski's been teaching people those survival skills. So I think, this is good for everybody's creativity. Excellent. And let's share the knowledge and wisdom while we can. And they still let us use question marks and spin these electrons around at each other.
Okay, first I have to say I listen to every podcast on double speed. I can't stand to listen to them on single speed anymore. When I listen to something on regular speed, I'm like, oh, they sound drunk. They're so slow.
I was worrying about it corrupting my ability to listen to people at real speed in situations like this. But if you're telling me I can listen to stuff faster and I can still do as you do, then I'll adopt that technology.
I think that's how I do what I do.
All right, cool.
Because there's no way I could consume as much material as I do. I've just trained myself to do it. So now I can do it. No problem. Secondly, I had to say, regarding the Arthur Conan Doyle stuff, that's interesting. It's been like 25 years since I read Doyle, but it's interesting to hear those tidbits. But on that note, go ahead.
I was just going to say the Irregulars, the British spies in America. That's after Conan Doyle's Irregulars. So there's a continuity. There's a continuity that I think you're going to find is really interesting in there.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that is interesting. On that note, I was going to ask whether you had read. I referenced it in my latest podcast on the Great Monetary Reset. What's it called? The Battle of Bretton Woods: John Maynard Keynes, Harry Dexter White, and the Making of a New World Order by Ben Steele.
I have not read it, but I know a little bit about Harry Dexter White. Let me bring that character up over here for just
interesting character, huh?
Yeah, I think he was a spy or something. Let's see.
Oh, well, yeah, some form of agent for someone. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. As Gata would say. Yeah. Did he die of he died of an overdose of digitalis? That was my notes on him.
Oh,
all right, let's bring that.
I don't know.
Let's see here. Oh yeah, he had a heart attack 3 days after testifying. Okay, so Columbia University educated. He's part of the fellow travelers, so he's a communist spy. Harvard University worked under Morgenthau Sr. and Morgenthau Jr. and the Morgenthau Plan came through him. He was part of the Jacob Golos spy network. He was mentioned during the House Un-American Activities Committee and overseen he was by NKVD. He was Secretary of the Treasury, also either worked for or university educated or worked at Stanford, University of Chicago ties, communist infiltration, and there should be, here's the proof. The Venona Project, which would be the transcripts of the wiretaps that proved that McCarthy was overall kind of a dick, but he was right. There's a whole bunch of other people, but let's see. IMF. Oh my goodness. Did he? Oh my goodness. Bretton Woods.
IMF created through the Bretton Woods Agreement, of which Harry Dexter White was the principal American negotiator.
And then they had something to do. They're supporting Mao Zedong. Oh, they're supporting Allende in 1973, September 11th. Oh, busy.
Well, I wouldn't say supporting, but maybe supporting the overthrow.
Yeah, supporting the overthrow. They had they had some influence or oversight. So the job of the model, just real quick, is those lines don't prove anything. I have to remember all these relationships. I just put there's this other communist spy, Laoshin Curry, that was also involved in IMF. And so when you get into some of the people that are part of the history and evolution of these societies, then you start to see, a bunch of these guys were these type of spies, but these guys were caught on these wiretaps, right? Because the Venona transcripts, if anyone doesn't know, these are wiretaps that went on in the 1950s, but they didn't have the computer technology to decrypt and decode them until the 1990s. So then you find out 40 years later that all these people that created this stuff were like Nazis and communists and stuff like that. And they're working all together with the globalists because, as Quigley said, they often work with the right and left and just control both sides for that vice.
Right. Well, I bring up the Steele book because it is, I think there's a lot of info in there in Bredenwoods that's interesting. As I said in the podcast, he's a bit normie, mainstream, but and he's a senior fellow at the CFR, so clearly you're not getting the full story. But anyway, there are some good tidbits, and you learn. To be fair, he does mention that White, in his Soviet ties and what have you, but doesn't really delve too deeply in what that means. That you've got these literal Soviet infiltrators at the heart of the creation of the monetary paradigm for the 20th century. Like, that seems important.
And then if you go to Anthony Sutton, you go back to who funds those communist Soviets and the Chinese. It's the same Western bankers that funded our government and the Nazis.
Yep, exactly right. And of course, Steele doesn't go at all into Keynes, which I know not only the Keynesian economics and all of that, but also, of course, an avowed committed eugenicist, president of the British Eugenics Society for several years. Never disavowed eugenics, despite what some of his biographers/apologists say. And actually, someone just pointed out in my comment section, AIER, the American Institute for Economic Resources. No, I'm not going to get that acronym off the top of my head. AIER.org just had a article published talking specifically about Keynes and eugenics and how all his biographers skirt around the issue, but it's actually central to it. But I was just mentioning that because that the story that Steele is telling there about White and Keynes and their opposing interests as to what they envisioned for the future. And Keynes was more for the Bancor. We need an international unit of settlement that'll be this international currency stewarded over by an international organization, because at the end of the British Empire, he's looking for, well, we don't want to just give everything to America. We don't want to hand the keys to the Americans to run it all. And White, coming from his perspective, although obviously there are many outside influences, wanted to make the dollar equals gold, guys. It's going to be the US dollar that we're going to peg everything to. And obviously White won out on that. But then that history keeps coming back in 2009 with the PBOC, the People's Bank of China governor, coming out and saying, no, we need to go back to Keynes and Bancor, this international idea. Oh, I don't know. Why don't we use the IMF special drawing rights? And I mean, there's so much history in there, but I think it speaks to my interpretation of part of that butting of heads between White and Keynes at Bredenwoods is the roundtable Anglo-Saxon sort of crew morphing from that original vision of Rhodes instead and their clique, but that saw more of a British-centered Anglo-Saxon empire. Like, Britain's going to be the center towards a more American-centered Anglo-Saxon vision, going for the Pax Americana that we've seen develop over the last 80 years. Anyway, I think that's an interesting book.
I know there's somebody, there's probably somebody in the audience who's thinking, well, it's all Mises and Hayek and these sort of things. And it's like, okay, there's also this to be considered. Even Mises was brought to America by the Rockefeller Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying he's a bad guy or anything like that. I'm just saying, like, look at who's paying the tab on his hotel and his rent and these sort of things. And I think Hayek, wasn't he like a personal tutor for David Rockefeller? Like, so even
was he? If he was, I didn't know that. I think
I'm pretty sure that Hayek he wasn't a protege of Rockefeller. I thought he was a tutor of it. Whereas Nelson mentored Heinz Kissinger. He picked him up in Ashcan, and David mentored Zabignew.
Yeah. Apparently, David picked Henry out of a lunch line or something along those lines, and Nelson ended up stewarding him. But at any rate,
I'm pretty sure there's an Anglo-American history on right after World War II. They were trying to sort out which Nazis to throw into the fire and which ones to keep, and Henry came on board. I'll have to find that research for you. And I I think I interviewed Jeff Steinberg from EIR, who wrote Dope Inc. or co-wrote Dope Inc., and he talks about it in that interview as well. So I'm going to dig that up for you.
Okay. I don't want to totally monopolize this whole time, so I just have one more question for you.
Yeah.
Are we in a post-literate society? If so, is that good or bad, and what does it mean?
Is that like a post-truth world?
Well, I'll define terms. My reading is that, of course, we know literacy broadly developed in the last few centuries because of the explosion of printed matter, because of the printing press that made text widely available. Suddenly, reading was not this, you had to literally be cloistered as a monk or whatever is to learn how to be a scribe. Suddenly, you have literacy for the masses. Good and bad. There are different aspects to that, but at any rate, it happened. So now we live in a society where, generally speaking, most people can read a book, read a newspaper. I mean, do they understand it? Maybe a different question, but at any rate, they can physically read words and understand enough to get by. But the idea of a post-literate society, there's a lot of really interesting philosophical things that we could say about that, and the sign and the signifier and the signified, and how text detaches us from the reality of the world, and does imagery actually bring us back to that? Is it more natural for us as human beings to process information visually and in terms of sound and tactile sensation rather than text on a page? I mean, that is a very artificial thing that clearly doesn't correspond to our natural state, whatever that may be. So the idea is that we're moving into a post-literate society where we are once again, because of the technology that we now have. Before, it was, the best way to write or to get a thought across to someone on the other side of the world, or 100 years from now, would be to write it down on paper so that they can watch it. Well, now we can record these things. This conversation will be being watched by people hundreds of years from now, right? So the idea is, are we moving beyond text? We don't need text anymore, and our more natural form of communication is auditory and visual. So we're going back to that because that's what the technology is allowing. Does that mean that these things are relics of the past? Is that true? Is that good? Is that bad? What do you think?
It's a deep question. I think that post-literate society is there if we want it. I don't think it's necessary. I think we can have a parallel literate society. I think reading has importance over history, and it's good to know how to read, but I also think that literacy is a form of slavery until a method of critical thinking is consistently practiced by the reader. And it's also a form of slavery when you're only reading what's prescribed or required for you and not what you're interested in to do your own learning. So it becomes a limiting factor there. True, I take in a lot of information from books, but I don't write necessarily books out of it. I make podcasts and films, and I do have book projects and these sort of things. But the primary way is I know it has to be an audiobook. I know it has to have a narrative format. And these are other aspects of, it's not about just logic and reason and exchanging facts with people. As you've demonstrated, it's about the narrative arc, because you can't fight these emotional responses just with facts. So you have to kind of get people to unlock their own minds. We can't do it for them. And that's done through, traditionally, it was done through rhyme and poetry, and then eventually they wrote it down, and now we're going back to visual and audio and these sort of things. But I also think it's a huge capacity to be able to read and write, and I think a lot of people today don't have the ability. Their kids aren't learning cursive, they're not learning how to read printed or these sort of things by hand. And look, I can't read this. So there are barriers being created that are pushing people away from being literate and having knowledge of that which exists. Because when you turn the electricity off, all these books are good. We're good. And if I need heat, I could even burn some of these CFR foreign affairs manuals over the 1920s all the way up, right? So there are some advantages, and getting locked into just, if it's all audio video and they do some cyber polygon, you're cut off from the ability to usefully communicate with other people. Whereas if you still know how to read and write, that's the essential way that people can learn to meet their needs without getting into violence and beating people over the head to take their stuff because they don't know how to learn. And if we got our learning abilities back, I think there'd be a lot less conflict out there. There'd be a lot more bridge building, and it'd be harder to divide and conquer us and put us into either a civil war or a second American Revolution situations, which is what they're building out here in America. So it's only in that absence of literacy and people speaking and showing and sharing these types of things that they can do the things they're doing. And so trying to close this gap as fast as we can seems to be a good investment of our time.
Yeah, I hear you. And yeah, on that very note, I mean, I'm going to throw up a book here. I weep to think that the World War I conspiracy has probably been seen by 1 million people at this point. This book has probably been read by a percentage point of that, even that much. And I weep to think about that, because if you had a choice, I would say read the book. There is so much more information in here than I can possibly cram into a audio-visual presentation that I don't even know how to articulate it. I mean, I can't say how much more information you can get from reading this book than you can from watching a documentary. But I know people would rather watch something on their screen than read a book. And I don't know how to combat that. All I'm trying to do is hopefully point people in this direction and get them motivated to read books like this so they can actually drill into the details.
Yeah, I don't think we have to fight that. I think we have to do what Buckminster Fuller said, and don't fight forces, use forces. So
Yeah.
I create
Well,
media
that
and
is
you
what I'm
create
doing, I
media.
guess.
Yeah, we create media so that we can point people toward, here's a document, you can go read it on your own time, or here's a book, you can go read it on your own time, but we're telling you why you would want to invest your time in it and put it on your schedule to do that thing and how it would enrich you, because without that knowledge, you have no idea as to why to make it prioritized or actionable. So I think that the media we produce, at the very least, it says, here's something like we're pointing toward, there's bigger picture. And that's one of the reasons you have so many fake quotes on the internet that float around that I was trying to sort out, like Colonel House, did he really say this? And yeah, or Woodrow Wilson, did he say this? Yeah, he says it over 8 pages. So of course, to tell somebody else, you got to shrink it down. But people should read those 8 pages and learn about the people you can't talk about unless you whisper, they'll destroy you.
Whisper in the corridors of power or whatever. Yeah, exactly right. And that was one of the things with my Century of Enslavement documentary, is that's really where I started to, okay, I really got to see, this quote is everywhere. Is it really real? Can I actually track it down? And there are so many banking quotes that are not real. You've heard them, you've seen them on all sorts of documentaries. It was in the Money Masters and everything. Nope, that quote ain't real, that quote ain't real, that quote ain't real. It was really interesting to actually drill down to, oh, this is a real quote. I can actually quote this one. That's good.
Another good real one is that David Rockefeller in his memoirs, where he's like, people accuse my family of doing this, this, and that. And he's like,
but the one that gets quoted everywhere is Baden-Baden, Bilderberg, 1991. I'd like to thank the New York Times for keeping this secret, blah, 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 whatever. It's one of those quotes that's too good to be true. And it is, because it's not true. At any rate, if it is true, there is no documentable reason for believing it. And I've really tried to nail that down over years, and there's nothing that I can pin down.
I got one more gem to share with you that I found this week, because I'm reading up on Klaus Schwab. Have you heard of this guy?
Well, yeah. Rings a bell.
Klaus, speaking like Klaus now. Okay, so he creates the World Economic Forum in 1971 at Davos. It becomes a thing a couple years later where they start calling it Davos. But I just want to show you this 1973 manifesto that these folks got together, the Davos Manifesto. Now, before I show you that, here's Otto von Habsburg. I don't know who he was in history, and he's with Klaus Schwab. So this is a guy who's related, I guess, to the ruling family of Europe back in the day. He's nothing to see here. Anyway, we're talking about this. Don't get distracted with that. At the third European Management Symposium, the Forum, the World Economic Forum, broadened its European focus under the theme, Shaping Your Future in Europe. This Davos meeting was held under the honorary sponsorship of His Royal Highness Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. The Commission of the European Communities renewed its patronage. 2 developments distinguished this Davos meeting. First, Aurelio Purce, the Italian industrialist, delivered a speech summarizing The Limits to Growth, a book that had been commissioned by the Club of Rome, a global think tank that he founded and served as its first president. The study caused a sensation after its publication in 1972 for calling into question the sustainability of global economic growth, reiterating some of the same concerns about demographics that the 18th century scholar Thomas Malthus had expressed. The authors examined several scenarios for the global economy and outlined the choices that society had to make to reconcile the economic development and environmental constraints. Sold over 12 million copies. Then they had a code of ethics, and this was called the Davos Manifesto. So this is what they're getting together to do. And the people that bring you the Great Reset today, it's not the first time they all got together and did anything. I just wanted to share, because James, you among a few people on this planet, you might know who Prince Bernhard was and what he had to do, or even Aurelio Purce, who sounds like a very nice guy. What are people missing in that? What aren't they saying?
Well, what sticks out to me is, of course, it always goes back to Malthus with these people. Always goes back to Malthus, who, of course, for people who don't know, has ties to the British East India Company that I'm not going to be able to rattle off the top of my head.
He taught at the British East India Company College.
Right. And exactly, people know him as a pastor or father or whatever. No, he was a British East India agent, essentially.
And they sold opium there, by the way, that addicted people on purpose.
Exactly. Yes, all part of the illustrious history of that organization. But yeah, he was, of course, the one who came out and said, "Oh, population is increasing exponentially. Food is increasing arithmetically. If you do the math, basically, we're all going to be dead in 30 years unless we take drastic measures." And that has been clung on to now for well over 200 years and drudged up over and over and over and over. And every generation, lo and behold, they find we're all going to run out. We're going to run out of resources in 20 years unless we do these drastic things. And of course, the limits to growth, which it mentions there, the Club of Rome document, was just at that time, the latest iteration. We've had other iterations since then, obviously, but in the 1970s, part of the Ehrlich-led revival of Malthusianism and the overpopulation scam, which relates back to stories about Soylent Green, but I forget the name of the book that Soylent Green was based on. But what do you remember the name of that book?
No, I just remember the punchline that Soylent Green is people.
Yes, exactly. And of course, I think Ehrlich wrote the foreword to that book, or was in one of the editions as a preface or something. Because of course, it's all going back to that, because that is their fundamental justification time and time again. Essentially, we are a herd of cattle or of mice, whatever, take your pick. And the overpopulation problem, as we started off today's episode with, the overpopulation of the herd of mice or whatever it is going to create all these problems. So we have to find responsible ways for keeping that in line. And that's why over and over and over, this is what it goes back to. No surprise. I didn't know that about the Davos Manifesto. Zero surprise that that's in there, because it's always at the heart of what they do. And it was at the heart of Gates. Of course, what is his overriding concern? What is the thing that keeps him up at night? The human population. And he shows in his little videos, he shows the curve. Look at the way human population is going. We need to do something to flatten the curve. And that's what these people obsess about. And you are the target of it. Whoever is listening to my voice right now, you are the target of these people. They hate your existence on this planet. You are cluttering up the planet that they want to live on. And that is every single time, that's what it goes back to with these people.
It's not like there's not solutions or countering information on that either, because Buckminster Fuller wrote several times on this in Grunch of Giants, and there's a couple other, and he shows Malthus was wrong. Here's why. And as human population grows, inevitably we are getting more and more efficient with our use of resources and all these things, and there's no problem, and the earth can sustain, I think he said 20 or 30 billion people without problem, but they choose to ignore that information. They choose to hide it away, which is why you got to read the books, And I could lay my hands on that Bucky book, but you get the point. There's stuff we got to read that wasn't pointed out and it wasn't assigned as homework. So we have to kind of discover it and assign it to ourselves.
Yes, and I will always throw in the reference to Julian Simon, who was, I think, the best critic of this mentality and fought against the Ehrlichs of the world, and pointed out that the greatest human resource is our brains and our ingenuity. The next genius that comes along that invents something that will increase the food supply 1 million times, or will do some other incredible thing that will once again expand the pie. It's with these Malthusian eugenicists, it's here's the pie and this is all we have, and every single person is trying to eat from this pie, so you're just a useless eater. We have to get rid of the useless eaters. And people start to internalize that and believe it. And of all the things that I cover, one of the ones that I get the most pushback from is about overpopulation. Well, the world is overcrowded, James. There are too many people. And people are thinking about it in completely the wrong way. We do not have a fixed pie. We have an expanding pie created by the ingenuity of new people coming into the human population. And the next genius who's going to revolutionize everything may be born tomorrow, or may be aborted tomorrow because of concerns about the overpopulation, or maybe just get a vaccine that ends up lowering their IQ to the point where they're not the next genius. And that's, to me, I cannot express how much I detest that attitude, that we have to attack the humans and keep them in line and kill the population, as opposed to letting them flourish, which is the other side of this. It's about flourishing rather than, oh no, we're going to overpopulate. No, we can expand the pie. It is not a fixed pie.
I think that's a great point. And I think that leaves it open for optimism and development and creativity and ingenuity and inventiveness and all the things that come from learning. And once you stop assuming that you know everything because you went to school or watched the TV. I think that's the spark of nature that needs to be reignited, that learning process.
Awesome. Happy note to end our conversation on, question mark?
For sure.
All right.
Thanks for stopping by. You're welcome to hang out for the rest of the show. I know you got a
Awesome.
busy day ahead of you, so we won't look when you leave.
All right. Thank you.
Right on. All right. So that was an unexpected yet very fruitful and fortuitous event there. I want to thank James and everyone who watches anything that he does, because that pulse of content that's getting out there is permeating a large group of people right now. And you might not see the effects, and we media producers might not see the effects yet, but people have a much better grasp of what's going on today than they did 10 years ago. And James and I have been around long enough to kind of see that trend. And as we continue to up our ability and level up our skills to articulate that which is going on and share it in a more streamlined, entertaining narrative arc, so that you can kind of catch up with what's going on, I think the faster that we can move toward physical freedom, cognitive liberty, and a type of peace that isn't because we don't have the ability to fight back. Thank you for watching this clip from Grand Theft World. You can find us on grandtheftworld.com. You can also see us every Sunday night, 9 p.m., streaming live on rockfin.com/Richard Grove. You can create a free account. You can see the live stream because YouTube's banning it, and we're moving elsewhere. So we'll continue to put clips here on YouTube. Thank you again for taking time to sample it. But what we want you to do is see the whole episode. You've got 168 hours in a week. It's not unreasonable to take 5 hours strategically to invest in understanding what's going on in the world, catch up on some contextual history, and we have some fun along the way. Also, if you go to grandtheftworld.com, we have a community feature there. You can sign up. You get a weekly briefing, a rundown of all the things that we found valuable during the week, maybe some things that got censored and moved to other platforms. You'll get relinked up to that, a whole bunch of other benefits that come with subscription. And if that's too much for you, just go to grandtheftworld.com and download the 2040 Strategic Trends document. It's a summary of what the British Ministry of Defense has planned for everyone's families going in the future. So become aware of the plans that exist. Also, fortify your knowledge with things that are substantial and meaningful and help you understand so you can make better decisions. That's the purpose of the Grand Theft World podcast, and we'll see you in the next clip. Thank you.